To understand what Iranian women lost in 1979, you first have to understand what they had, because the image that most of the Western world carries of Iran, the black chadors, the morality police, the women arrested for showing their hair, is so dominant, so visually powerful, so thoroughly the image of Iran that the 20th century bequeathed to the 21st, that it is genuinely difficult to hold in mind the other image, the one from before, the one that shows Iranian women in miniskirts on the streets of Tehran, women in universities and law courts and parliament, women who could divorce their husbands and keep their children and travel without permission and become judges and senators and ministers of state. Both images are real. They are separated by a single year, 1979, and by a revolution that transformed one of the most rapidly modernizing societies in the Middle East into one of the most restrictive theocratic states in the world, almost overnight. How that happened, how rights that had taken decades to accumulate were dissolved in months, how women who had marched alongside the revolution found themselves almost immediately marching against it, how the most educated and liberated generation of Iranian women in history lost nearly everything they had gained in the time it took a new government to write new laws, is the story we are going to tell. The Iran that existed before the revolution was not, by any measure, a democracy. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the king who ruled Iran from 1941 until his exile in January 1979, ran an authoritarian state backed by the Savak, his feared secret police, that tortured and imprisoned political opponents without the constraints of law or due process. The Iran of the 1970s was a country where dissent was dangerous, where political opposition was crushed, where the wealth flowing from the oil nationalization of 1951 and the subsequent oil boom had enriched an elite while leaving large portions of the rural and urban poor behind. This context matters enormously for understanding the revolution and what happened to women within it. The Shah's modernization program, the White Revolution, announced in 1963, was real and significant in its effects on women's lives. It was also imposed from above by an autocratic government on a society that had not fully consented to it, in a way that generated genuine cultural and religious resentment among traditional and religious communities who felt that their values were being overridden by a secular westernizing elite with the Shah's blessing and the CIA's backing. The women's rights that the White Revolution produced were real. They were also entangled, in many Iranians' minds, with a regime they hated for entirely other reasons. The White Revolution's provisions for women were, by the standards of the early 1960s Middle East, remarkable. In 1963, women were given the right to vote and to stand for election, and in the parliamentary elections of September 1963, 6 women were elected to parliament, with 2 more appointed to the Senate by the Shah. By the eve of the revolution in 1978, women held 22 of the 268 seats in parliament. 333 served on local councils, and 5 were judges sitting on the Iranian bench, iranprimer.usip. The family protection laws of 1967 and 1975 went further still, raising the legal age of marriage for women from 13 to 18, giving women the right to initiate divorce, establishing family courts designed to provide fair treatment in marital disputes, and limiting the practice of polygamy. These were not cosmetic reforms. They were structural changes to the legal framework governing women's lives, changes that gave Iranian women, particularly urban educated women, a degree of legal autonomy that was genuinely unprecedented in Iranian history and comparable to the legal status of women in many Western European countries of the same period. Wilson Center. The Iran of the 1970s that these laws produced was visible in its cities in ways that startled foreign visitors. Tehran was a city of 4 million people, with universities, cinemas, restaurants, and nightclubs. Women walked its streets in Western dress, or in traditional dress, or in anything in between, by choice. They drove cars, ran businesses, practiced medicine and law, taught in universities, appeared on television,
competed in athletics, traveled abroad without requiring their husband's permission. The University of Tehran had significant female enrollment. Iranian women were studying in Europe and America and returning with professional qualifications that they deployed in a society that, at least in its urban, educated sectors, had made room for them. The photographs from this period have become almost iconic in Iranian political discourse. Images of Iranian women in the 1970s that look to contemporary eyes indistinguishable from photographs taken in Paris or London or New York at the same time. They circulate online, shared by Iranians in the diaspora and by women inside Iran, as evidence of what was possible, as proof that the condition of women under the Islamic Republic is not traditional or inevitable or the natural expression of Iranian culture, but the specific product of a specific political decision made in a specific year. The photographs are weapons in an ongoing argument. The argument is not over.
But the pre-revolutionary picture was not as uniformly progressive as those photographs suggest, and the history is not served by simplifying it. The White Revolution's reforms reached most completely into the urban, educated middle and upper classes, the women whose lives the photographs documented. For rural women, for poor urban women, for women in traditional religious communities, the legal changes were often more distant from daily reality than the laws themselves implied. A law giving women the right to divorce meant something very different to a wealthy Tehran professional with access to lawyers and courts than it did to an illiterate rural woman in a village where the local mullah's opinion carried more practical weight than the family protection court in the nearest city. Retrospect Journal, 2025-06-06, The Impact of the 1979 Revolution on Iranian Women, Gains, Losses, and Contradictions. The Shah's reforms were also, crucially, reforms imposed by a government that did not otherwise value freedom. The same state that gave women the vote denied all Iranians the right to free political organization. The same savak that left secular educated women largely alone tortured leftist and Islamist men in its prisons. The modernization was selective, authoritarian, and perceived by many Iranians, including many women, as a form of cultural imperialism, the imposition of Western values by a king who was seen as an American client, a puppet of foreign interests who was using women's liberation as a way of demonstrating his Westernness to his backers, while suppressing the authentic political and religious identity of his people.
This perception that the Shah's feminism was not genuine feminism, but political theater in the service of a regime that was simultaneously oppressing the people it was supposedly liberating, was one of the most powerful arguments available to the revolutionary opposition, and it was an argument that many women found compelling. Women participated in the 1979 revolution in enormous numbers. They demonstrated in the streets, they organized in mosques and universities, they published and agitated and took genuine risks for the cause of ending the Shah's regime. Many of them wore the hijab, some because they were genuinely devout, some as a deliberate symbol of opposition to the Shah's westernization program, a visual rejection of what they saw as cultural imperialism. The women who chose the hijab as a revolutionary symbol in 1978 and 1979 had not, most of them, anticipated that it would become compulsory. The distinction between choosing to cover and being required to cover seems obvious in retrospect. It is the difference between a political gesture and a legal obligation, between an act of personal conviction and a government mandate enforced by police. But in the heat of the revolutionary moment, with the Shah's regime crumbling and the euphoria of imminent change filling the streets, that distinction was not always as visible as it would become within weeks of the revolution's success.
Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the religious leader who became the revolution's dominant figure and the Islamic Republic's first supreme leader, had been explicit about some of his views on women's rights before the revolution. He had opposed the White Revolution in 1963, specifically including women's suffrage among his objections, and had been sent into exile partly as a result.
His writings and speeches made clear his belief that Islamic law should govern the Iranian state, and that the Shah's family protection laws were incompatible with Islamic jurisprudence. And yet significant numbers of secular and left-wing women supported the revolution, partly because they believed that Khomeini's religious authority would not translate into a theocratic state, partly because they trusted assurances given by more liberal revolutionary figures that the new Iran would be a pluralistic republic, and partly because their hatred of the Shah's regime was strong enough to override their doubts about what might replace it. The desire for change in 1979, the Washington Institute would later note, overshadowed the progress made for women during the 50 years prior to the revolution, and women's freedoms consequently proved more fragile than anyone knew. Washington Institute.
The fragility was not accidental. The rights that Iranian women had accumulated under the Shah were real, but their institutional foundations were shallow. They rested on the will of one man, the Shah, and on the legal architecture of a state that could be dismantled as quickly as it had been built. They had not grown from the bottom up, from a broad social consensus that women's equality was a fundamental value of Iranian society that any government would be obligated to honor. They had grown from the top down, from a monarch's modernization program, and when the monarch fell, the program fell with him. The revolution did not have to fight for women's rights the way it had to fight for other changes. It simply stopped protecting them. The women who understood this, who saw the institutional fragility of the rights they had gained and recognized what a change of government might mean, were among the loudest voices warning against the revolution's direction in early 1979. They were not heard. The revolutionary coalition was too broad, the Shah's opposition too united, the moment too intoxicating for the specific warnings of secular feminists to carry the weight they deserved. The revolution succeeded, and within weeks it became clear what its success was going to cost.
On March 7, 1979, International Women's Day -1, Khomeini announced that all women in government workplaces were required to wear the hijab. The announcement came barely a month after the revolution's final victory, barely a month into the new Iran that hundreds of thousands of women had marched and risked and sacrificed to bring into being. The response was immediate. On March 8th, International Women's Day itself, more than 100,000 women took to the streets of Tehran to protest. Nurses, students, mothers, secular professionals who had thought the revolution was for them. They marched in front of the Palace of Justice, chanting a slogan that has echoed down the decades since. In the dawn of freedom, there is an absence of freedom. rarehistoricalphotos.com. The protest delayed the implementation of the hijab mandate temporarily, and the government retreated for a moment, claiming Khomeini's statement had been only a recommendation. But the direction was clear to anyone who was paying attention. The women in the streets of Tehran on International Women's Day 1979 knew what was coming. They were not wrong.
As the words slow and the thought settles, let this rest. A country in transition. The old Iran still visible in the streets and the universities and the courtrooms. The new Iran not yet fully formed, but already announcing itself in the mandates and the rollbacks, and the revolutionary courts that were beginning to replace the institutions that the Shah had built. Women who had spent their adult lives in a society that, whatever its other failures, had given them a degree of legal and professional autonomy their mothers had not had. Standing in the streets of the capital, on the day the world had designated for celebrating women's progress, protesting the government they had helped bring to power. The chant they chanted on that day, "In the dawn of freedom, there is an absence of freedom," was not just a political slogan. It was a precise description of where Iran was on March 8, 1979. The old constraints were gone. The new ones had not yet fully arrived. In that narrow window, before the laws were written and the courts were established,
and the morality police were given their authority. The women of Iran stood in the street and said, clearly and loudly, that they knew what was coming, and they refused to accept it. What came next? The specific mechanisms by which decades of accumulated rights were dismantled, law by law, institution by institution, across the months and years that followed the revolution, is what the chapters ahead will examine. But it is important to begin here, in the before, in the world that existed before the revolution rewrote everything. Because you cannot understand what was lost without first understanding what was there to lose.
Revolutions need bodies. They need people willing to fill the streets, to absorb the tear gas and the batons and the bullets, to make themselves visible in numbers large enough that the regime facing them understands that the calculation has changed, that suppressing the opposition will cost more than accommodating it. The 1979 Iranian Revolution was, by this measure, one of the most successful mass mobilizations in modern history. By the autumn of 1978, the streets of Tehran and cities across Iran were filled with millions of people demanding the end of the Shah's rule. And among those millions, in numbers that surprised observers at the time and have been systematically underappreciated in the decades since, were women. Not women as background figures, not women as supporting cast to a drama directed by men, women as organizers, as frontline protesters, as political prisoners, as martyrs, women who ran underground networks and printed forbidden pamphlets and hid revolutionary operatives in their homes and stood in the crowds on Black Friday when the Shah's forces opened fire and did not run. Women who understood with complete clarity that they were fighting for their country's future and who did not or could not fully see that the future they were fighting for had not budgeted space for them.
The revolutionary coalition that brought down the Shah was one of the broadest and most ideologically diverse in the history of modern revolutions. It included secular nationalists, Marxists and socialist groups, liberal Democrats, Islamic modernists, and the traditional religious establishment represented by the network of clerics loyal to Khomeini. What united these groups was not a shared vision of the future, but a shared enemy. The Shah, his secret police, his authoritarian rule, his perceived subservience to American and Western interests. The breadth of the coalition was its strength in bringing down the monarchy. It was also the source of its fatal internal contradictions once the monarchy was gone. Women participated across virtually every faction of this coalition. In the secular left, the Tudeh Party, the Fedayeen, the Mojahedin Khalq, women held genuine leadership positions, were treated as political equals in organizational structures, and understood the revolution as simultaneously a national liberation struggle and a social revolution that would advance women's rights alongside every other form of human emancipation. In the religious nationalist camp, women participated as devout Muslims who believed that an Islamic Republic would be more just, more authentic, and more truly liberating than the Shah's pseudo-modern autocracy. The Mojahedin Khalq, the PMOI, sometimes called the MEK, is worth examining in some detail because its treatment of women was genuinely radical by the standards of revolutionary Iran and illustrates the range of positions on women's rights within the anti-Shah movement. The PMOI was an Islamist Marxist hybrid organization that had taken up arms against the Shah in the 1970s, lost many members to Savak's torture chambers, and emerged from that experience with an organizational culture that explicitly rejected gender hierarchy. Women were given leadership roles, trained in military resistance, treated as full equals in the political and operational structures of the organization. For young Iranian women who joined the PMOI, the organization offered something genuinely unusual, a revolutionary politics that did not require them to choose between their faith and their equality, that held out the possibility of an Islamic politics that was not patriarchal, that demonstrated through its own practice that women could lead and fight and decide. Many of these women would later find that promise betrayed, as the PMOI's internal culture became increasingly authoritarian, and as the Islamic Republic it helped create turned against it. But in the moment of revolution, the PMOI represented one of the most fully realized visions of women's revolutionary participation available.
The mothers who gathered outside Tehran's Qasra prison, whose children were held inside by the Shah's security services, tortured and sometimes executed for their political activities, were a different kind of revolutionary actor, and in some ways a more powerful one. They were not members of organized political parties. They did not have ideological programs or factional affiliations. They had children in prison and the refusal to be silent about it. They came to the prison gates repeatedly, demanding information about their children, demanding access, demanding the release of political prisoners, putting their bodies and their grief in visible public space where the regime could not easily ignore them. Their activism was simultaneously entirely conventional, mothers seeking their children, and deeply politically subversive. The Shah's government found it genuinely difficult to manage because the tools available for managing political dissidents, arrest, interrogation, discrediting, were harder to apply to grief-stricken mothers without producing images of state brutality that undermined the regime's legitimacy. The mothers demonstrated something that the more ideologically sophisticated revolutionary actors sometimes missed, that the most powerful political acts are sometimes the ones that are hardest to categorize, that do not fit neatly into the regime's framework for understanding and suppressing opposition.
Black Friday, September 8, 1978, was the day that made the revolution irreversible, the day the Shah's government crossed a line from which return was impossible. The government had declared martial law, and when thousands of demonstrators gathered in Jaleh Square in Tehran in defiance of that declaration, the military opened fire. The death toll is disputed. The revolutionary narrative claimed thousands. Later estimates suggest hundreds, but the specific number matters less than the fact of the massacre, the image of a government killing its own people in the street for the act of assembly. Women were in Jaleh Square. They were in the crowd that the soldiers fired into, and they were among the dead. They were also in the crowds that gathered afterward, in the days and weeks that followed Black Friday, when the realization that the Shah had chosen violence over accommodation spread through Iranian society and radicalized the millions who had been watching from the margins, uncertain whether to join the protest movement or wait to see how it resolved. Black Friday did not create the revolution. It made it inevitable, and the women who survived it, who had been in that square and had not run, knew they had been part of the moment that changed everything.
Khomeini, directing the revolution from his exile in Paris, understood the importance of women's participation and worked with considerable political skill to secure it without making promises he intended to keep. His public statements about women's rights during the revolutionary period were carefully calibrated for maximum breadth, vague enough to be acceptable to secular women, specific enough to be reassuring to his religious base. In one speech, he declared that Islam cares more for women than men, that women have the right to vote, the right to be elected, the right to work if they choose, the right to authority over their own affairs. Iran Wire. These were not complete lies. Under the Islamic Republic that Khomeini created, women did retain the right to vote. They did continue to work and to be elected to parliament in limited numbers. But the framing that what Islam grants women is better than what the West grants was doing enormous work, concealing beneath its apparent generosity the specific rights that Islamic jurisprudence, as Khomeini interpreted it, did not grant: equal rights in marriage and divorce, equal rights in inheritance, the right to dress as one chose, the right to be a judge, the right to pass one's nationality to one's children. The speech sounded like a promise of equality. It was a promise of something considerably more limited. The secular feminist organizations that existed in pre-revolutionary Iran were among the groups most acutely aware of the gap between Khomeini's rhetoric and his actual positions on women's rights. Organizations like the Women's Organization of Iran, the largest women's organization in the country under the Shah, with 2 million members, had been deeply compromised by their association with the royal government, and this association made it impossible for them to play an effective role in the revolutionary debate about what the new Iran would look like for women. They were too identified with the old regime to be trusted voices in the new conversation. The independent feminist voices that existed, intellectuals, activists, journalists, who had developed a women's rights politics that was not dependent on the Shah's patronage, were present and vocal in the revolutionary period, but they were voices in a coalition that was dominated by forces less concerned with women's issues and increasingly dominated by Khomeini's ideological framework. In the excitement of that revolution, as one Iranian scholar put it, nobody paid much attention to what Ayatollah Khomeini was saying in Paris. The specific things he was saying, his writings on Islamic governance, his positions on women's legal status, his vision of the Islamic Republic, were available to anyone who wanted to read them. Most people were reading something else.
The hijab that many revolutionary women chose to wear in 1978 and 1979 was one of the most consequential acts of political symbolism in the revolution's history, and its meaning was more complex than it appears in retrospect. For devoutly religious women, it was simply the appropriate Islamic dress, the expression of their faith in public space, unremarkable in its motivation, if newly significant in its political context. For secular nationalist women who adopted it during the revolution, it was something different, a deliberate rejection of the Shah's westernization program, a symbol of cultural authenticity and resistance to the foreign influence that the Shah represented, a visual solidarity with the religious communities that formed the revolution's mass base. The irony is precise and painful. Women who put on the hijab as an act of free political choice in 1979, as a symbol of their agency, their authenticity, their rejection of imposed westernization, found within weeks that the same garment had been converted from a voluntary act into a legal requirement. The symbol of their freedom had become the instrument of their unfreedom. The act they had performed to demonstrate their autonomy had been appropriated into a system designed to deny autonomy. The hijab they chose and the hijab they were required to wear were the same cloth. The distance between them was the distance between revolution and its betrayal.
There is a deeper structural explanation for why so many women, including secular, educated, professionally accomplished women, participated in a revolution that would curtail their rights so severely. It lies in the hierarchy of oppressions that the revolutionary moment produced. The Shah's government was simultaneously a modernizing force for women's rights and a brutal authoritarian state. For a woman who had a professional career and legal protections under the Shah, but who had also seen her brother arrested by Savak, who had friends who had been tortured in Evin prison, who understood the regime's corruption and violence intimately, the calculation between keeping the rights she had and ending the system that gave her those rights was not simple. The Iranian left, in particular, operated with an ideological framework that placed national liberation and class struggle above what it categorized as bourgeois feminism, the argument common in revolutionary left politics of the 1970s globally that women's liberation would follow automatically from the defeat of imperialism and capitalism, that fighting for specifically feminist goals was a distraction from or a luxury within the larger struggle. This framework led many left-wing women to subordinate their concerns about women's rights to the broader revolutionary agenda, to trust that the revolution would deliver equality once it had dealt with the Shah, to defer the specifically gendered demands to a later moment that, as it turned out, never came. Womenstudies.Barnard.
As the words slow and the breathing settles, hold this image. Autumn of 1978. The streets of Tehran full of people, millions of them, the largest protest movement the country had ever seen. Among them, everywhere, women. Women in chadors and women in jeans. women in headscarves and women with uncovered hair, religious women and secular women, and communist women and nationalist women, and women who had not decided what they were, except that they were against the Shah and for something better. They were not naive, most of them. They had made calculations, imperfect calculations, made with incomplete information, under conditions of genuine political excitement and genuine fear, in a moment when the old order was crumbling and anything seemed possible. They had weighed what they might lose against what they might gain, and they had decided, for a variety of reasons that all made sense within their individual situations, that the revolution was worth the risk. What most of them had not calculated, could not fully calculate, because it moved so much faster than any of them had anticipated, was how quickly the revolution would turn its face away from them. Not after years of political struggle, not after a prolonged contest between competing visions of the new Iran, but within weeks. Within the same month that the Shah left and Khomeini returned, the laws had begun to change. The world that Iranian women had helped build was already being dismantled, and the chapter ahead will show exactly how fast and how completely that dismantling happened.
Revolutions have mornings after. The barricades come down, the celebratory gunfire fades, the crowds that filled the streets return to their homes, and the question that was temporarily suspended by the euphoria of victory reasserts itself with sudden urgency. Now what? Who governs? By what principles? With what laws? In whose name and toward whose benefit? These questions are always contested in the aftermath of revolution. The coalition that united to destroy the old order fractures almost immediately over the question of what the new order should be, and the fracturing is always faster and more brutal than the people who were unified by their shared enemy anticipated. In Iran, in February 1979, the fracturing began within days, and the fault line along which it opened, the first and most immediate and most visible, was women. Within 2 weeks of the Shah's departure and Khomeini's triumphant return, the new revolutionary government had issued its first specific directives about women's conduct. Within 2 months, the family protection laws that had taken years to build were suspended. Within a year, the legal architecture that had defined women's status in Iranian society for 2 decades had been almost entirely demolished. The speed was not accidental. It was a statement. The new Iran was announcing what it was, and it was announcing it first through the bodies and the legal status of its women. The first announcement came on February 26, 1979, 15 days after the revolution's final victory. Khomeini declared that women working in government ministries were required to observe Islamic dress. The announcement was specifically directed at government employees, not yet a universal mandate, but its direction was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The government, the state that women had helped bring into being, was beginning to regulate their appearance. iranprimer.usip.blog.2020, August 11th, Iranian Women's Movement, 4 phases. The reaction was immediate. Women in government offices removed their headscarves in protest. Demonstrations formed outside ministry buildings. The resistance was real, and it was large. These were not marginal voices, but significant numbers of professional women who had built careers in the government apparatus and who understood with professional precision what was being announced. The response from the revolutionary government was to retreat slightly, to insist that the announcement had been only a recommendation, not yet a legal requirement. The retreat was tactical. The direction had not changed.
March 8, 1979, International Women's Day, barely 4 weeks after the revolution's victory. More than 100,000 women took to the streets of Tehran. The demonstration began at Tehran University and moved through the city, the marchers chanting slogans that had been updated from their anti-Shah predecessors to address the new government directly. We did not make a revolution to go backward. In the dawn of freedom, there is an absence of freedom. Freedom is neither Eastern nor Western, it is universal. Rare historical photos. The marchers were attacked, not by the Shah's forces, those were gone, but by revolutionary men who disagreed with the protest, who threw stones and eggs, who shouted insults, who in some cases physically assaulted the women in the street. Hezbollah men, members of the revolutionary Islamist militia, confronted the marchers with violence, tearing at the clothing of women they deemed improperly dressed, screaming at them that they were agents of imperialism and enemies of the revolution. The women who had marched against the Shah were being attacked in the streets of their own city by men who claimed to be defending the revolution those women had helped make. Int Policy Digest, Before and After, Iran, 1979.
The family protection laws, the legislative achievement that had taken the women's movement years to build and that represented the most significant legal advances of the pre-revolutionary period, were suspended almost immediately after the revolution. The suspension was announced without legislative process, without debate, without the parliamentary procedure that the law's passage had required. They were simply declared incompatible with Islamic law and set aside. The immediate practical consequences were devastating and specific. With the suspension of the family protection law, women lost the right to initiate divorce on equal terms with their husbands. Men regained the unilateral right to divorce, the ability to end a marriage by pronouncing the talaq formula without requiring a court proceeding or a woman's consent. The family courts that had been established to adjudicate marital disputes fairly were abolished and replaced with Islamic courts presided over by clerics who were operating under a jurisprudential framework that assigned women half the legal weight of men.
The age of marriage was among the most immediately shocking rollbacks. Under the family protection laws, the minimum age of marriage for girls had been raised to 18, a reform that had taken years of advocacy to achieve, and that had represented a genuine intervention against the child marriage practices that remained common in rural and traditional communities. The new revolutionary government abolished this minimum almost immediately, reverting to the Sharia standard as Khomeini's government interpreted it. The minimum age of marriage for girls dropped to 13. Then, as the Islamic Republic consolidated its power and the most conservative interpretations of Islamic jurisprudence gained institutional dominance, it dropped further, to 9 years old, following the Sharia doctrine that used the Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha as the precedent for the minimum age of marriage. 9 years old. Girls who had not yet finished primary school were legally marriageable. The women who had marched on International Women's Day 1979 understood exactly what this number meant. They had spent years fighting to raise it from 13 to 18. It had been returned to 9 in a matter of weeks. The female judges were among the first professional casualties of the new order, and their removal illustrated with particular clarity the theological logic driving the rollbacks. Under the Shah, women had served as judges. Shirin Ebadi, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, had become Iran's first female judge in 1975. The Islamic Republic determined that women could not serve as judges because Islamic jurisprudence, as interpreted by Khomeini's government, required that judges be male. The theological reasoning was specific. The judge's role required rational and impartial judgment, and women's testimony and judgment were, under the classical Islamic legal tradition that the new government was implementing, worth half that of a man's. Shirin Ebadi and her female colleagues were dismissed from the bench in 1979. They were offered a choice. They could remain in the justice system as clerks or administrative staff, working in the same buildings they had formerly judged in, performing subordinate functions under male judges who may have had less experience and less qualification than the women they had replaced. Ebadi refused the degradation of the clerkship and eventually returned to practice as a lawyer, a path that would lead, through years of defending political prisoners and women's rights cases, to the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. But the immediate fact was stark. Women who had earned their positions through years of legal education and practice were removed from those positions by government decree, for no reason connected to their competence or conduct, solely because of their sex. The mass firing of women from government positions was not limited to the judiciary. Across the government apparatus, women were removed, encouraged to resign, or simply not replaced when they left. One estimate cited in Ali Mahdi's documentation of the period, put the number of women who lost government jobs in the immediate post-revolutionary period at approximately 24,000. Professional women were fired in mass and explicitly encouraged to return to their homes, to their roles as wives and mothers, to the domestic sphere that the new government considered their natural and appropriate domain. The ideological framing that accompanied these firings was not primarily hostile to women as individuals. It was framed with a consistency that suggests careful theological preparation as liberation. Women were being freed from the burden of employment, freed from the false liberation of the Shah's westernized professional culture, freed to fulfill their true and divinely ordained roles as mothers and homemakers. The language of freedom was being used to describe the removal of freedom, the same rhetorical inversion that the hijab mandate had deployed, the choice being replaced by the compulsion, while the vocabulary of authentic selfhood was applied to the compulsion.
The universities underwent their own rapid transformation. Gender segregation was introduced, men and women separated in classrooms and common spaces. Certain fields of study were designated inappropriate for women. Engineering, agriculture, and other technical subjects deemed unsuitable for female students began to close their admissions to women. The reasoning, again, was theological and simultaneously practical. Women who were going to be wives and mothers did not need technical educations, and the mixing of male and female students in technical environments was declared incompatible with Islamic values. Iranprimer.usip. The academic women who had built careers in Iranian universities, professors, researchers, department heads, faced their own version of the professional call that was removing women from government. Some were fired outright. Others found their positions quietly eliminated or their authority undermined. The universities that had been among the Shah's most visible symbols of modernization, with their female faculty and their gender-mixed classrooms, were being reshaped, systematically and rapidly, into institutions that reflected the new government's vision of Islamic education. The revolutionary courts, established in the immediate post-revolutionary period to try the Shah's officials and process the enormous backlog of political cases, operated outside the legal framework that had previously governed Iranian jurisprudence, without defense counsel, without right of appeal, without the procedural protections that the Shah's civil courts, whatever their other failings, had maintained. Women who appeared before these courts, whether as defendants or as witnesses, found themselves operating in a system where their testimony counted for half what a man's testimony counted for, where the judges were all male, where the Islamic procedural rules applied to them were those of the most conservative interpretations of classical jurisprudence. The penal code that the Islamic Republic began implementing in 1981 introduced punishments that shocked the country's secular population with their severity. Stoning for adultery, flogging for a range of moral offenses. The blood money provisions, the diya, the compensation owed by the family of a criminal to the family of a victim, established that a woman's life was worth half a man's. If a man killed a woman, the blood money owed to her family was half what would be owed if the victim had been male. The law was encoding in the most literal financial terms the proposition that women were worth less than men.
As the words slow and the breathing settles, hold the specific timeline in mind. February 11, the revolution's final victory. February 26, the first hijab directive for government workers. March 8, 100,000 women in the streets, attacked by revolutionary militias. March through April, the family protection laws suspended, the family courts abolished, the female judges dismissed, the mass firings beginning. By the end of 1979, the minimum marriage age dropped to 13 on its way to 9. The new constitution ratified with its explicitly unequal treatment of women. The Islamic Republic consolidated enough to begin implementing the penal code that would follow. 10 months. Less than a year from the revolution's victory to the near-complete demolition of the legal framework that had defined women's rights in Iran for 2 decades. The women who had marched on International Women's Day 1979 had been right about everything. right about the direction, right about the speed, right about the specific laws that were being targeted. They had said clearly and publicly what was coming. They had been attacked in the streets for saying it, dismissed as agents of imperialism and enemies of the revolution, their warnings categorized as counter-revolutionary rather than prescient. They were not counter-revolutionary. They were the revolution's most honest voices, the ones who understood that a revolution that did not include women was not a revolution but a transfer of power from one group of men to another. What had been transferred in the 10 months that followed February 11, 1979, was now clear, and the women of Iran, stripped of their legal protections, fired from their jobs, required by law to cover their bodies, facing a legal system that valued their lives at half the value of men's, were going to have to decide what to do about it.
There is a detail about the history of the hijab in Iran that almost nobody in the West knows, and it changes everything about how the story of 1979 should be understood. In 1936, 43 years before Khomeini made the hijab compulsory, Reza Shah, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, made the hijab illegal. He ordered the forcible unveiling of Iranian women. His police literally tore headscarves and chadars from the heads and bodies of women in the streets. Women who refused to go out uncovered stayed home rather than be seen in public without the covering they had worn their entire lives. Devout women wept. Some never left their homes again during Reza Shah's reign. Both rulers, the Shah who banned the veil and the Ayatollah who mandated it, justified their policy with the same language. Both claimed they were liberating women. Both claimed they were acting in women's best interest. Both used the female body as the surface on which they wrote their political ideology, one in the ink of forced unveiling, one in the ink of compelled covering. The continuity is not incidental, it is the point. In Iran, across the 20th century, what women wore on their heads was never simply a matter of personal dress. It was a political declaration, a statement of state ideology, a line in the sand between two visions of what Iran was and should be. The women whose heads the state was fighting over were, in both cases, the last people consulted. Canopy Forum.
Khomeini's theological justification for compulsory hijab was grounded in his interpretation of Islamic jurisprudence, but was, as scholars of Islamic law have noted, considerably more extreme than mainstream Islamic scholarly opinion required. The Quranic verses most commonly cited in support of hijab, primarily from Surah An-Nur and Surah Al-Ahzab, call on believing women to guard their modesty and draw their coverings over their bosoms, language that has been interpreted across the history of Islamic scholarship in a wide range of ways, from the most conservative full-body covering to much more moderate requirements of modest dress. Canopy Forum, 2023, August 4th. Iran's political agenda, women's bodies at the intersection of religion and law. The theological concept that Khomeini's government was actually implementing was not, strictly speaking, the Quranic hijab, but a political elaboration of it, what scholars have called the Islamic sitr, the concept of covering, transformed into the explicitly political hijab that became the Islamic Republic signature. As one analysis put it plainly, the Islamic Republic's position that it is merely carrying out a religious mandate is disingenuous. The hijab that Khomeini mandated was not the organic expression of Quranic requirement, but a political symbol, a weapon of the revolution, a visible daily marker of the Islamic Republic's authority over women's bodies in public space. Khomeini himself said it directly in his religious sermons. The hijab was a symbol for which the revolution's martyrs had shed their blood, a line that cannot be crossed. Washington Institute, 2023.
The legal implementation of compulsory hijab moved through several stages with a deliberateness that reveals the strategic thinking behind it. The first directive in February 1979 applied only to government workplaces. The resistance it generated, the International Women's Day March, the protests, the international attention, caused a tactical retreat, with the government insisting the directive had been a recommendation rather than a requirement. But the direction never changed.
In July 1981, mandatory veiling was formally decreed for all women in public. In July 1981, mandatory veiling was formally decreed for all women in public. The decisive legal step came in April 1983, when the hijab requirement was incorporated into Iran's Islamic Penal Code, the first legal enforcement of compulsory hijab for all women in Iran, including non-Muslims, foreigners, and tourists. The punishment written into the law was precise and brutal. Women who appeared in public without religious hijab would be sentenced to whipping of up to 74 lashes. Not a fine, not a warning, not community service. 74 lashes applied to the body of a woman whose offense was the exposure of her hair in public space. The law was encoding in the most physical possible terms the proposition that the female body in public was state property and that the state's rules for that property would be enforced with physical violence.
The specific form of covering that the Islamic Republic demanded evolved over time toward increasing severity. The initial requirement was for modest dress and a headscarf covering the hair. As the Republic consolidated its power and the most conservative voices within it gained institutional dominance, the preferred covering moved toward the maknai, a one-piece head covering in plain fabric in dark colors, covering the chest and back shoulders, and the full chador worn over it. Women who covered but did not cover sufficiently, who wore colorful headscarves pushed back from the hairline, who allowed a strand of hair to show, who wore makeup visible beneath the headscarf, these women were bad hijabi, improperly covered, subject to the same enforcement machinery as women who covered not at all. The concept of bad hijab, hijab-e-bad, became one of the most operationally significant categories in the Islamic Republic's management of women's bodies in public. It allowed the enforcement apparatus to operate not just against women who openly defied the hijab requirement, but against women who nominally complied, but did so in ways that expressed their resistance: the pushed-back headscarf, the colored fabric, the fitted coat, the ankle-revealing hem. Every such choice was a small act of defiance. The regime understood it as such. The enforcement machinery was calibrated to address not just non-compliance, but insufficiently enthusiastic compliance, the sartorial expression of a population that was obeying the letter of the law while refusing its spirit. The enforcement of the hijab requirement between 1979 and the formal establishment of the morality police in the early 1990s was chaotic, violent, and largely informal. Between the first directives and the formal institutionalization of the Gasht-e-Irshad, the guidance patrol, the morality police, the enforcement was carried out by whoever took it upon themselves to enforce it. Revolutionary militia members, Basij volunteers, police officers acting on personal initiative, random men in the street who felt authorized by the general atmosphere of revolutionary religious enforcement to confront women they judged insufficiently covered. The informality was, in some ways, more frightening than formal enforcement would have been because it was unpredictable. A woman walking to work could not know whether she would be confronted today or not, whether the man approaching her was going to say nothing or attack her, whether a particular street or neighborhood had a higher concentration of informal enforcers than the one she had just left. The randomness was not a failure of the system, it was a feature of it. A population that cannot predict when enforcement will occur must assume it will always occur, which is more effective at producing behavioral compliance than any formal enforcement regime could be. The Gasht-e-Irshad, the Guidance Patrol, formally established in the early 1990s under Supreme Leader Khamenei, gave the enforcement machinery an institutional form and a distinctive green van that became one of the most feared sights in Iranian public life. The patrol's procedure, as it operated across its decades of existence, was to stop women deemed to be in violation of the hijab requirement, lecture them on their offense, escort them to a police van, take them to a station, require them to sign a form pledging not to repeat the offense, and sometimes hold them until a male relative came to collect them with a change of appropriate clothing. The humiliation was as much a part of the procedure as the legal consequence. Being stopped by the morality police, being publicly identified in front of neighbors and passers-by and colleagues as a woman who had failed to comply with the dress code,
carried a social cost that operated alongside and sometimes exceeded the formal legal consequence. The Islamic Republic understood the enforcement of hijab as an act of public education as well as legal compliance. Each stop was a demonstration, performed in public space, of the state's authority over women's bodies and its willingness to exercise that authority visibly and regularly.
The resistance to compulsory hijab was as continuous as the enforcement, never fully suppressed, always present, taking forms that ranged from the individually subtle to the collectively spectacular. The pushed-back headscarf was resistance. The colored silk scarf instead of the prescribed dark fabric was resistance. The coat fitted to show the shape of the body. The ankle boots with the slightly too short manteau. The carefully applied makeup visible above the required covering. Each of these choices was a daily negotiation between what the law required and what the woman wearing the clothes was willing to accept. Iranprimer.usip. More visible forms of resistance developed over the years. The White Wednesdays campaign, women wearing white headscarves on Wednesdays as a visible sign of protest, was one organized response. Women posting videos of themselves removing their headscarves in public and waving them on sticks, a form of protest that carried serious legal consequences, became a regular feature of the landscape of resistance. Masih Ali-Nejad, the Iranian journalist and activist who founded the My Stealthy Freedom campaign from her exile in the United States, collected thousands of photographs sent by Iranian women showing themselves uncovered in public, a collective visual record of the gap between what the law required and what the population actually wanted. Iranprimer.usip.
The theological argument that the Islamic Republic has consistently made for compulsory hijab contains, embedded within it, a particular view of women and men that reveals the ideology beneath the religious framing. The argument runs approximately as follows. Women's bodies are inherently provocative to men. The exposure of women's bodies or hair in public creates fitna, social disorder, sexual disruption, the undermining of the moral order. Therefore, women are required to cover in order to protect social order and protect themselves from the consequences of male desire they would otherwise provoke. The argument places the responsibility for male sexual behavior on women's clothing choices rather than on men's self-control. It treats women's bodies as objects that require management rather than as the property of the women inhabiting them. It assumes that the purpose of women in public space must be evaluated and regulated in terms of their potential effect on male behavior rather than their own purposes and intentions. And it gives the state, exclusively male-governed, the authority to manage the danger that women's bodies represent by requiring those bodies to be covered. The hijab in this framing is not a rite or a tradition or a spiritual practice. It is a management tool for the perceived problem of women's existence in public space.
The women who resisted the hijab from the beginning, and there were always women who resisted, understood something that the theological framing was designed to obscure. The compulsory hijab was not primarily about modesty or religious observance or social order. It was about visibility. A woman walking uncovered in Tehran was visible as herself, as a specific individual with her own appearance, her own choices, her own presence. A woman walking in the required covering was visible as a category, as a covered woman, an Islamic woman, a woman whose appearance declared the Islamic Republic's authority over her body. The covering did not hide women, it replaced their individual visibility with a collective, state-mandated one. Every woman who pushed her headscarf back a centimeter, who chose a color that the regulations discouraged, who wore her hair slightly visible above the prescribed line, was insisting on her individual visibility against the categorical visibility the state required. The enforcement apparatus understood this. That is why the bad hijabi, the imperfectly covered woman, attracted as much enforcement attention as the uncovered one. It was not the hair that was the offense, it was the assertion of individual identity against the state's demand for categorical compliance.
Slow and the breathing settles.
Hold this. A piece of cloth. A headscarf. A chador. A makne. A material so simple that its physical weight is almost nothing, that it can be folded into a pocket, that a child can lift it without effort. And around this piece of cloth, across more than 4 decades of the Islamic Republic's history, one of the most sustained and costly political conflicts in the lives of Iranian women. Arrests, beatings, lashes, lost jobs, lost careers, lost freedom, and eventually, as we will see in the chapters ahead, lost lives. The hijab was never just cloth. In 1936, it was the cloth the Shah tore from women's heads to prove his modernity. In 1979, it was the cloth women chose to wear to oppose that same modernity's authoritarian air. In 1983, it was the cloth the state said it would administer 74 lashes to enforce. In 2022, it was the cloth that Mahsa Amini was arrested for wearing improperly, whose death in police custody lit a fire that burned across every province of Iran for months and has not been fully extinguished since. A revolution had been made partly to replace the forced unveiling of one Shah with the political independence of an authentic Iranian culture. What Iranian women got instead was forced covering, the same political logic, the same state authority over the same bodies, the same refusal to ask the women themselves what they wanted. The cloth changed direction. The power over whose head it sat did not.
Before 1962, Iranian law placed women in the same legal category as minors, criminals, and the insane. That sentence is worth reading again, slowly. Not as a metaphor, not as an approximation, as a precise legal description of how Iranian civil law categorized adult women, alongside children who had not reached the age of majority, alongside people convicted of crimes, alongside people deemed mentally incompetent to manage their own affairs. Women could not vote. They could not stand for public office. They could not be guardians of their own children. They could not work or marry without the permission of their male benefactors. They could be divorced at any moment, with or without their prior knowledge, by their husband's utterance of a simple formula. They could be presented at any moment with a second, third, or fourth wife sharing their home, with no legal, financial, or emotional recourse. Iran's family protection laws of 1967 and 1975 were built to dismantle this structure, to remove women from that legal category, to give them the standing of adult persons before the courts, to establish that their marriages were contracts with enforceable terms rather than revocable licenses granted by their husbands. It took years of advocacy, years of political pressure, years of careful legal drafting to build the framework that those laws established. It took the Islamic Republic approximately 48 hours to suspend them.
The family protection law was suspended immediately after the revolutionaries came to power in 1979. The family protection law was suspended immediately. Men could once again divorce their wives at will. The speed was deliberate and symbolic. The clerical establishment that had opposed the family protection laws from the moment of their passage in 1967 had been waiting 12 years for this moment, and the suspension of the laws was among their first acts after assuming power, a statement of theological and political priority that told Iranian men everything you needed to know about where they stood in the new order. Wilson Center. What the suspension restored immediately and practically was the talaq, the unilateral male right to divorce. Under the family protection law, divorce had required a court proceeding, a judge's involvement, a process that gave women time and legal standing to contest the terms of their separation, to negotiate custody arrangements, to ensure financial settlements. With the suspension, a husband could once again divorce his wife by pronouncing the formula, "I divorce you," 3 times, and the marriage was dissolved. No court, no notice, no negotiation. The woman might not know she had been divorced until her husband told her, or until she was already gone from her home. Retrospect Journal. Polygamy, the right of Muslim men under classical Sharia to take up to 4 wives simultaneously, had been sharply restricted by the Family Protection Law of 1975, which required that a husband obtain both the consent of his first wife and the approval of a court before taking a second wife. The restriction had been one of the law's most significant practical achievements, substantially reducing the practice in the years of its operation. Its abolition in 1979 restored polygamy to its pre-reformed status, a right that a husband could exercise without requiring his existing wife's consent, without court approval, without any formal process beyond the religious marriage contract. The muta, temporary marriage, a practice specific to Shiite Islam that allows a marriage contract to be established for a fixed period ranging from an hour to 99 years in exchange for a specified sum paid to the woman, had also been discouraged under the Shah's family law framework. The Islamic Republic not only restored it, but actively promoted it as an Islamic alternative to what it called Western sexual immorality. The muta gave men legal access to women for specified periods without the ongoing obligations of permanent marriage. It gave women, particularly poor women, widows, divorced women with no other means of support, a formal legal transaction in place of the informal arrangements that poverty and social vulnerability had always created. Whether it represented liberation or exploitation was a question the women involved answered differently depending on their specific circumstances, but the power asymmetry embedded in its structure was impossible to miss. Child custody arrangements under the Family Protection Law had moved toward giving mothers substantial rights, particularly the right to keep young children, especially daughters, in their care after divorce. The Islamic jurisprudence that replaced the Family Protection Law returned custody to the classical Sharia framework, which assigned young children to the mother for specified periods, boys until the age of 2, girls until the age of 7, and then transferred custody automatically to the father. The transfer was not subject to the mother's agreement. It was not subject to a court's assessment of what was in the child's best interest. The concept of the child's best interest, which is the organizing principle of modern family law systems across the world, was not the operative framework. The operative framework was the father's right, established by theological authority, to his children after the specified ages. A woman who had raised her son for 2 years, who had built her life around his care, found at the end of those 2 years that the law had never considered him hers to keep. He belonged to his father. The law had always said so. The Family Protection Law had briefly interrupted that saying. The revolution restored it. Inheritance law under the Islamic Republic encoded the inequality between men and women in the most arithmetically precise terms. The numbers are specific and have not changed in their essential structure since 1979. A widow inherits 1/8 of her deceased husband's estate if they had children, 1/4 if they had none. A widower inherits his deceased wife's entire estate. A daughter inherits half of what a son inherits from the same parents. Until 2009, women could not inherit land at all, only the monetary value of land, not the land itself, and only if the other heirs agreed to pay it. iranprimer.usep/blog/2020/deg/08/part3 Iranian Laws for Women. The mathematical precision of these provisions, half, 1/4, 1/8, was not incidental. It was the explicit expression of a theological position that assigned women half the legal weight of men in the domain of property and inheritance, derived from classical Islamic jurisprudential reasoning about women's different financial obligations relative to men. The reasoning was coherent within its own framework. Men are obligated to support their wives and families financially. Women have no such obligation, therefore men receive larger inheritance shares to meet their larger financial obligations. The counter-argument that in practice many Iranian women were their family's primary or sole financial support, and that the theological framework did not match the social reality, was not addressed by the law, which operated from the theological premise regardless of the lived reality it governed. The testimony of women in Iranian courts was given half the legal weight of men's testimony, a provision drawn directly from classical Sharia jurisprudence and implemented without modification in the Islamic Republic's legal system. In criminal cases, 2 female witnesses were required to provide the evidentiary equivalent of 1 male witness. In some categories of case, including the capital offense of adultery, female testimony was not sufficient at all, regardless of quantity, to establish guilt without male corroboration. In the blood money provisions, the diya, The compensation owed by the family of a perpetrator to the family of a victim assigned Iranian women's lives a specific monetary value that was exactly half the value assigned to men's lives. If a man killed a woman, the blood money his family owed to her family was half what would be owed if the victim had been male. The Islamic Republic was not being arbitrary or careless in this provision. It was being theologically consistent, applying the same half-weight that Islamic jurisprudence assigned to women in testimony and inheritance to the domain of life itself. A woman's life, in the monetary language of the law, was worth half a man's life. The state had put a price on the difference and written it into the penal code. A partial correction to the blood money inequality was achieved in 2019, not by changing the theological framework, but by circumventing it. The Supreme Court ruled that the difference between the blood money for a woman and the blood money for a man would be paid from a government fund for bodily injuries, so that the family of a female victim would receive the full amount rather than the half amount that Sharia stipulated. The woman's blood money remained, in theological and legal principle, half a man's, but the state would make up the difference from public funds. The ruling was widely noted as a step forward, and it was, in its practical effect on the compensation received by victims' families. But its structure was also a precise illustration of the Islamic Republic's approach to the contradictions between its theological commitments and the demands of its population. The theology could not be changed. That would be apostasy, a challenge to the foundations of the entire system. But the theology's practical consequences could sometimes be ameliorated, padded, made less directly painful, while the theological principle itself remained intact and unquestioned. Progress was possible, but only within the theological frame. The frame was not available for renegotiation. The permanent marriage contract under Islamic law included two provisions that, in the Islamic Republic's implementation, combined to give women a specific and limited form of financial leverage that was not available to them in the domains of custody, inheritance, or legal testimony. The mehr, the marriage portion, a sum specified in the marriage contract as the husband's gift to the wife, became legally enforceable in the Islamic Republic's courts in a way that gave wives who were being divorced without their consent a mechanism to demand financial settlement. The practical operation of mehr as a women's protection was complicated and imperfect. A mehr specified in gold coins at the time of marriage decades earlier, for example, could be demanded at its full current gold value, a sum that might be ruinous for the husband, and that therefore gave the wife leverage to negotiate better terms for her divorce, her custody arrangement, her financial settlement. Women's rights lawyers developed sophisticated strategies for using mehr demands as negotiating tools within the profoundly unequal framework of Islamic family law. It was not equality. It was the creative extraction of leverage from a legal system designed to deny leverage, the navigation of constraint by people who had no better options. The cumulative effect of the legal framework that replaced the family protection laws was to reconstitute Iranian women across every domain of family and civil law as legal half-persons, people whose testimony was worth half, whose inheritance was worth half, whose lives were worth half, and who could be divorced unilaterally, lose their children automatically, be superseded by additional wives without recourse, and travel abroad only with their husband's written permission. The permission requirement for travel is one of the less discussed provisions, but its daily practical significance was enormous. A woman could not obtain a passport or leave the country without her husband's signed authorization, making her physical mobility legally contingent on his consent. The legal structure was not, its architects insisted, oppressive. It was protective. It reflected the different but complementary roles assigned to men and women in the Islamic theological framework, the different obligations and different rights that flowed from those different roles. The framing was consistent and theologically coherent, and to many Iranian women living under it, felt exactly like what it looked like from the outside, a comprehensive system for maintaining male control over women's mobility, finances, children, and legal standing, given theological legitimacy by the regime that enforced it. As the words slow and the breathing settles, let the numbers rest in the mind. 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. 2 female witnesses equal to 1 male. blood money at 50%, marriage age of 9, children transferred at 2 years, then 7, husband inherits everything, wife inherits a fraction, divorce pronounced unilaterally, travel requiring written permission. Each number a specific legal provision, drawn from a specific theological source, applied by a specific government to the specific lives of specific women, who had, many of them, spent years fighting for a different set of numbers. The women who had built the family protection law framework, who had argued for it in committee rooms and lobbied for it in parliamentary sessions, and explained it to rural women in village meetings, and trained the female lawyers and judges who would operate within it, watched those numbers be replaced in the weeks and months after February 1979. They watched the framework they had built be dismantled with a speed that made the years of building feel, in retrospect, like the construction of a sandcastle at low tide. The tide had come in. The sand was gone. What remained was a legal system that encoded in numbers precise enough to be calculated and enforced the proposition that the women of Iran were worth less than the men beside them. Not as a cultural attitude that could be argued with, not as a social norm that could be changed through education, as a law with the full weight of the state and the full authority of Islamic jurisprudence behind it, written down, enforced, and for the women living under it, inescapable, unless they could find, in the decades ahead, ways to push back that the law had not anticipated and the state had not yet closed.
There is a word in Persian, irshad, that means guidance. It is a gentle word, a word with spiritual connotations, a word that suggests leading someone toward the good rather than forcing them away from the bad. The official name of Iran's morality police, Gasht-e-Irshad, the Guidance Patrol, was chosen with the precision that authoritarian institutions bring to the naming of their instruments of control. Not the compulsion patrol, not the dress code enforcement unit, the Guidance Patrol. The name implied that the women being stopped in Tehran streets, being pulled into green vans, being subjected to the physical and psychological humiliations of the enforcement procedure, were receiving guidance, spiritual assistance on their journey toward proper Islamic conduct, offered with the care of a teacher for a student who has made an understandable mistake. The gap between the name and the reality was one of the most precisely calibrated deceptions in the Islamic Republic's management of its own public face. The women who had been detained knew it was not guidance. The women who had been beaten in the vans knew it was not guidance. The family of Mahsa Amini, who received her from the Guidance Patrol's custody in a coma that she did not recover from, knew with final certainty that whatever it was not guidance. But the name persisted, official and unchanged, for decades, a bureaucratic euphemism for an institution whose actual function was the physical enforcement of the Islamic Republic's authority over women's bodies, performed in public, in front of witnesses, as a daily demonstration of who held power and what they were willing to do with it.
The morality police was not part of the original revolutionary apparatus. It evolved, gradually and somewhat chaotically, from the informal enforcement culture of the revolution's early years. In the months after 1979, enforcement of the hijab and other Islamic conduct standards was carried out by whoever took it upon themselves to do it: revolutionary committees, Basij militia volunteers, individual men acting on the implicit authorization of the general enforcement atmosphere. This informal enforcement was in many ways more frightening than institutional enforcement would have been, because it was unpredictable and unaccountable, with no formal procedures to constrain it and no institutional identity to hold responsible for its excesses. The Gasht-e-Irshad was formally established in 2005 under the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who had during his mayoral campaign suggested a more relaxed approach to enforcement, but who, after his election, moved swiftly in the opposite direction. The formal establishment gave the enforcement machinery a consistent identity, a distinctive uniform, the green vans that became immediately recognizable, and a set of procedures that were more predictable than the informal enforcement that had preceded them, more predictable but not less violent, and arguably more systematic in their humiliation. BBC. The standard operating procedure of the Gasht-e-Irshad, as documented by human rights organizations and by the accounts of women who experienced it, followed a specific sequence that was designed as much for its psychological impact as for its legal function. Officers, both male and female, the female officers specifically deployed to have physical contact with female detainees, would approach a woman judged to be in violation of the hijab requirement, identify the specific violation, and issue a verbal instruction to correct it. If the woman complied immediately, pulled the headscarf forward, covered the hair that was showing, buttoned the coat, she might be released with a warning. If she did not comply, or if her compliance was deemed insufficient, she would be directed to the green van. In the van, and at the detention facility where she was taken, she would be subjected to the re-education procedure, a session in which the violation was explained, a declaration of Islamic morality was read, and the woman was required to sign a form acknowledging her violation and pledging not to repeat it. She would be held until a male relative arrived with appropriate clothing to replace whatever she had been wearing. She now had a criminal record. The next offense would carry a more serious consequence. The accounts of what happened inside the green vans and inside the detention facilities go considerably beyond this official procedure. Women who spoke to the BBC and other human rights organizations described beatings in the vans, verbal abuse, deliberate humiliation. One woman described being told to remove her shoes before boarding the van, signing a form admitting to inappropriate clothing, and leaving with a criminal record. Others described threats more specifically calibrated to maximize psychological distress. One woman reported being threatened by officers who told her they would put cockroaches on her body. The pattern of abuse was not random or individual. It was systematic enough to constitute institutional practice. The violence and humiliation, not the unauthorized excess of particular officers, but the understood and implicitly approved method of an institution whose deterrent function depended on the fear it generated. The formal procedure's purpose was compliance. The informal procedure's purpose was terror. Both were required for the institution to work, and the Islamic Republic maintained both with the consistent attention of an organization that understood what it was doing and why. The morality police's operations fluctuated significantly depending on which faction held political dominance at any given moment. During the presidency of Mohammad Khatami, the reformist president who held office from 1997 to 2005, enforcement was relatively relaxed, the patrols less frequent, the standards of acceptable dress somewhat more permissive, in practice, if not in law. Women in Tehran during the Khatami years could walk with more hair showing, wear brighter colors, present themselves with more individual style, without the same certainty of confrontation that characterized stricter enforcement periods. The fluctuation was not an accident of individual presidential temperament. It was a deliberate political tool, the loosening and tightening of enforcement as a mechanism of political management, a way of rewarding the population for political quiescence and punishing it for political activism, of signaling the regime's current mood and its current level of tolerance for the distance between what the law required and what the population actually did. The women of Tehran understood this mechanism with the expert knowledge of people who had lived inside it for decades. They read the current level of enforcement as a political thermometer, an indication of what the regime was thinking and how much pressure it was currently willing to apply. The institution that Ahmadinejad formalized in 2005 was, by the standards of its own public justification, supposed to be about guidance. But its actual targets revealed a different logic. The morality police did not enforce equally across all populations. They were deployed most heavily in affluent, educated, urban neighborhoods, the areas where women were most likely to push the boundaries of enforcement, where the pushback headscarf and the fitted coat were most common, where the gap between what the law required and what the population wanted was most visible and most politically significant. The class dimension of the enforcement was not incidental. The Islamic Republic was not uniformly concerned with the dress standards of rural women in traditionally covered communities, where the hijab was worn out of custom and faith without the political charge that urban noncompliance carried. The enforcement apparatus was concentrated where it served a political purpose, in the spaces where women's resistance was most visible, where the symbols of that resistance were most legible, where the demonstration of state authority was most necessary to the regime's management of its own legitimacy. September 13, 2022. Mahsa Amini, 22 years old, Kurdish Iranian, visiting Tehran from her home city of Sanantaj in western Iran, was stopped by the Gasht-e-Irshad at the Haqqani metro station in Tehran. The stated reason was her hijab. She was wearing it in a way the officers deemed improper. She was arrested and taken to the Vozara detention facility for what was described as a re-education class. 26 minutes after arriving at Vozara, Mahsa Amini collapsed. She was taken to Kasra Hospital 30 minutes later, arriving in a coma. She never recovered consciousness. On September 16, 2022, she died. She was 22 years old. Her name in Kurdish, the name her family used, the name that became the slogan of the uprising that followed her death, was Jina. It means life. Amnesty.org. The Iranian government's response to Mahsa Amini's death followed the script that the Islamic Republic had used for every previous case of death or serious injury in state custody. They denied that physical violence had occurred. They attributed her death to a pre-existing heart condition, a condition her family said she did not have. They produced doctors to testify to the pre-existing condition. They prevented her family from seeing her body fully, her father reporting that authorities covered bruises on her body in the hospital and refused to let the family examine them. home.treasury.gov. The United Nations fact-finding mission on Iran, reporting in March 2024, concluded unambiguously that this denial was false. Based on the evidence and patterns of violence by the morality police in the enforcement of the mandatory hijab on women, the mission was satisfied that Mahsa Amini was subjected to physical violence that led to her death in custody. Iran was held responsible for the physical violence that killed her. The Iranian government, which had maintained its denial for 18 months, did not respond to the UN's findings. The gap between what the institution called itself, the Guidance Patrol, and what it had done to a 22-year-old woman from Kurdistan was contained in those two sentences, and no amount of official denial could close it. PBS. The morality police was formally suspended following the nationwide uprising that Mahsa Amini's death triggered in September 2022. In December 2022, the Iranian Attorney General announced that the Gasht-e-Irshad had been shut down, a statement that was widely reported internationally as a significant concession to the protest movement. The reality was more ambiguous. The formal patrol stopped for a period, but enforcement of the hijab requirement did not end. It was transferred to other police units, to CCTV surveillance systems that identified improperly dressed women and issued summonses, to a new legislative framework that was being prepared in parallel with the apparent concession. In July 2023, the morality police officially resumed street patrols, the announcement confirming what many had suspected, that the December 2022 suspension had been a tactical retreat rather than a genuine policy change. In October 2023, 17-year-old Armita Garavand fell into a coma after an alleged encounter with morality police officers on the Tehran metro and was later declared brain-dead. The Islamic Republic denied any connection between the officers and her condition. The pattern was unchanged. The institution had returned. The denial was the same. The name remained Guidance.
As the words slow and the breathing settles, hold this. An institution that called itself Guidance but practiced violence, that claimed to be protecting women but killed them in its vans, that said it was enforcing divine law but served political control, that could be suspended when the political cost of operating it became too high and resumed when the political calculation changed.
The morality police was not an aberration within the Islamic Republic's system. It was the system made visible, the daily street-level expression of the proposition that the Islamic Republic had maintained since 1979, that women's bodies in public space were the state's domain, that the state's authority over those bodies would be enforced physically if necessary, and that the enforcement would continue regardless of its human cost. Mahsa Amini died 26 minutes after arriving at a facility named for the concept of guidance. Her death lit a fire that burned across every province of Iran, that shook the Islamic Republic more seriously than anything since the revolution itself, that introduced the chant, "Woman, Life, Freedom," that became the most powerful expression of Iranian women's resistance since the marchers of International Women's Day 1979 had said, "In the dawn of freedom, there is an absence of freedom." 43 years separated those two slogans. The institution that connected them, the enforcement apparatus that had been present in one form or another since the first days of the Islamic Republic, was still operating when Mahsa Amini arrived at Vazara. It was still operating after she left in a coma. It was still operating in some form today. There is a temptation when telling the story of what the 1979 revolution did to Iranian women to tell it entirely as a story of loss, of rights stripped, laws reversed, careers ended, bodies policed, lives diminished. That story is true. Every detail of the preceding chapters has documented its truth with the precision of legal texts and police records and human rights reports. But it is not the whole story, because alongside every act of suppression, sometimes beginning within hours of it, sometimes separated from it by decades of grinding institutional pressure, there were women who refused, who organized, who built organizations and launched campaigns and defended clients and wrote books and went to prison and went into exile and kept going from exile, who turned the Islamic Republic's own legal system against itself wherever it left a crack, who paid costs that most people in most places will never be asked to pay for the simple act of saying, "This is wrong, and I will say so out loud." The resistance of Iranian women to the Islamic Republic's treatment of them is one of the most sustained and creative and costly human rights struggles of the last half-century. It has produced 2 Nobel Peace Prize laureates in 20 years. It has generated legal strategies and organizing methods and forms of civil disobedience that have influenced women's rights movements across the Muslim world. It has been met consistently and brutally with imprisonment, torture, exile, and death, and it has not stopped. Shirin Ebadi was already being dismissed from her position as a judge when the Islamic Republic was still sorting out its initial institutional arrangements in 1979. She had been Iran's first female judge, appointed in 1975, and the revolution's determination to remove women from the judiciary ended her judicial career before it had fully begun. The Islamic Republic offered her a clerkship, work in the same building, under male judges who had less experience and less qualification, performing subordinate functions in a system she had formerly led. She declined. What Ebadi did instead, over the following 2.5 decades, at steadily escalating personal risk, was use the law as a weapon for the people the law was being used against. She opened a private practice and began defending political prisoners, human rights activists, dissidents, the families of people murdered by regime agents. She took cases that no one else would take, represented clients whose association with them was itself a mark of political suspicion, argued before courts that were constitutionally hostile to everything she was arguing. In 2000, she was arrested herself for criticizing the regime's judicial conduct. She was imprisoned. She continued. The Nobel Peace Prize that Ebadi received in 2003 was both a recognition and a provocation. It was a recognition, the Nobel Committee's explicit statement that what this woman had been doing in Tehran courts for 25 years, at personal risk and without international protection, was among the most important human rights work being done anywhere in the world. And it was a provocation, because the Islamic Republic's response to one of its citizens receiving the world's most prestigious human rights award was to make her life progressively more untenable until she was forced to leave. The Iranian government initially minimized the award, calling it a political act against the Islamic Republic rather than a genuine recognition of Ibadi's work, publishing newspaper editorials arguing that the Nobel Committee had selected her to embarrass Iran rather than honor her. Then, after Ahmadinejad's re-election in 2009, the regime's response became more direct. They closed her human rights organization, the Defenders of Human Rights Center. They raided her office. They assaulted her husband. They confiscated her Nobel Peace Prize medal, the physical gold medal, seized by the state, an act without precedent in the history of the prize. They froze her bank accounts and charged her with tax evasion. She left for London. She has not returned. She continues to work for Iran's democratization from exile, because exile did not end her work, it relocated it. Narges Mohammadi was still in Iran when she received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2023. Specifically, she was in Evin prison, one of the Islamic Republic's most notorious detention facilities, where she had been imprisoned for her human rights activism. She was not released to attend the Nobel ceremony. Her children, who live in exile in France, accepted the prize on her behalf. The image of two children standing at the Nobel podium in Oslo to accept a prize for their imprisoned mother, who was at that moment sitting in a cell in Tehran, was one of the most precise visual summaries of what the Islamic Republic had built that the 21st century has produced. Mohammadi had been arrested, convicted, and imprisoned multiple times before the Nobel Prize. 13 arrests, 5 convictions, sentences totaling more than 31 years in prison and 154 lashes. Each imprisonment was followed by another campaign, another human rights report, another legal defense of another political prisoner, another interview with another journalist about the conditions inside Evin. The Islamic Republic imprisoned her repeatedly because she kept doing the thing they imprisoned her for, and the thing she kept doing was telling the truth about what was happening inside Iran's prisons and to Iran's women. The Nobel Committee recognized exactly what she had been doing and why it cost what it cost. Wilson Center, Iranian Women, Enthusiasm, Rebellion.
The 1 Million Signatures campaign, launched in August 2006 on a summer afternoon on the streets of Tehran, was one of the most ambitious and methodologically innovative women's rights campaigns in Iranian history. Its goal was as straightforward as its name: collect 1 million signatures from Iranian citizens in support of changing the discriminatory laws that governed women's legal status, the inheritance laws, the testimony laws, the marriage and divorce laws, the blood money provisions. The method was face-to-face conversation in public spaces between activists and ordinary Iranians, parks, buses, workplaces, homes, the deliberate choice to build the movement through personal encounter rather than through institutional channels that the government controlled. The campaign's organizers understood that the face-to-face method was about more than signature collection. Each conversation was an act of consciousness raising, a moment in which an ordinary Iranian was invited to consider whether the laws governing their mother's inheritance or their sister's divorce were actually just, whether the arithmetic of legal half-personhood that the Islamic Republic had written into its codes reflected their values or someone else's. The conversations were often long. They were often difficult. They produced across hundreds of thousands of individual encounters, something that institutional campaigns rarely achieve, the gradual person-by-person questioning of what had been allowed to become normal. The Islamic Republic's response to the 1 Million Signatures campaign followed the pattern that had become familiar across 4 decades of suppressing women's activism. Key organizers were arrested. Delaram Ali, one of the campaign's founders, was sentenced to 34 months in prison and 10 lashes for her role in a related demonstration. Others were charged with the standard categories that the Islamic Republic applied to political activity it wanted to criminalize: membership in an illegal organization, propaganda against the system, collusion against national security. The charges were designed to make the campaign's existence a criminal act rather than a political one, to reframe the collection of signatures for legal reform as a threat to the state rather than a petition to it. icanpeacework.org, 2013, September 23, the 1 Million Signatures Campaign, an effort born on the streets. The legal strategy of criminalizing women's rights activism, of treating the demand for equal inheritance rights or equal divorce rights not as a political position that could be argued with, but as a security threat that required prosecution, was one of the Islamic Republic's most effective tools for suppressing organized resistance. It meant that the most committed and visible women's rights activists spent significant portions of their lives navigating criminal charges, sitting in courtrooms defending their right to exist as civil society, managing the legal and financial burdens of prosecution, rather than doing the organizing work that the prosecution was designed to prevent. The legal system that they were trying to reform was simultaneously being used as the instrument of their suppression. Iran International 2024 HWTC 287582.
The journalists who reported on women's rights in Iran and who reported on the violations that the Islamic Republic wanted to keep invisible paid their own category of costs. Nilufar Hamedi and Elahe Mohammadi were among the first journalists to report on the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022. Hamedi reached Kasra Hospital while Amini was still alive and photographed the image that became the first visual record of what the morality police had done, Amini's mother weeping in the hospital corridor, the grief that preceded the death, that preceded the uprising. Mohammadi reported from Amini's funeral in Saqqez. Both journalists were arrested within weeks of their reporting. Both were held in Evin prison. Both were tried on charges that included spreading propaganda against the system and colluding against national security. Their crime was journalism, the documentation of a death that the government was simultaneously denying had occurred the way it occurred. The Islamic Republic's response to their reporting was to imprison the reporters, as if the imprisonment of the messengers could retroactively change the fact of the message. More than 100 journalists were locked up or prosecuted in the 2 years following Amini's death. Both journalists were arrested within weeks of their reporting. Both were held in Evin prison. Both were tried on charges that included spreading propaganda against the system and colluding against national security. Their crime was journalism, the documentation of a death that the government was simultaneously denying had occurred the way it occurred. The Islamic Republic's response to their reporting was to imprison the reporters, as if the imprisonment of the messengers could retroactively change the fact of the message. More than 100 journalists were locked up or prosecuted in the 2 years following Amini's death. The methods of resistance that Iranian women developed across 4 decades were as varied as the women who developed them, ranging from the individual and daily to the collective and spectacular. The pushed-back headscarf and the colored fabric of Chapter 4 were resistance. The women who memorized Shireen Ebadi's phone number and called it when their husband was arrested were resistance, using the legal system's own procedures as a tool of protection for the people the system was persecuting. The women who shared information about their legal rights through informal networks, which provisions of the mayor could be enforced, which courts were slightly more receptive to women's arguments, which procedural technicalities could be exploited, were building a parallel legal literacy that the formal legal system did not provide. IranPrimer.usip. The women who wrote, who kept writing, inside prison and outside it, who published memoirs of their detention and legal analyses of the system that detained them, and fiction that carried the weight of experience that direct testimony would have made too dangerous, were resistance. The women who left Iran and used the freedom of exile to continue saying what they could not say from inside were resistance. The women who stayed when leaving would have been safer, who calculated that the work they could do from inside Iran was worth the risk of staying, were resistance. Each choice was its own form of defiance, made by a specific person in a specific circumstance, adding to a collective record of refusal that 4 decades of suppression had not been able to end. The generational dimension of the Iranian women's resistance movement is one of its most remarkable features. The women who marched on International Women's Day 1979 were in many cases the mothers and grandmothers of the women who marched under the Woman Life Freedom banner in 2022. What those younger women inherited from their predecessors was not just a political tradition, but a specific knowledge. The knowledge that the Islamic Republic was not permanent, that its pronouncements about divine mandate were political claims rather than cosmic truths, that the laws it had written could be changed by the same mechanism that had changed the laws before them, organized human pressure, applied with consistency over time, at personal cost, without guarantee of immediate result. wilsoncenter.org/article-Iranian-women-enthusiasm-rebellion. The young men who joined the 2022 protests, who marched alongside the women, who chanted Woman Life Freedom, who in some cases cut their hair in solidarity with women who were cutting theirs as acts of mourning and defiance, represented something that the women's movement had been arguing for since 1979. That the question of women's rights in Iran was not a women's question, but a freedom question. That a society that denied legal equality to half its population was not free for anyone. That the struggle for women's dignity was the same struggle as the struggle for everyone's dignity.
As the words slow and the breathing settles, hold these names. Shireen Ebadi, judge turned lawyer turned Nobel laureate turned exile. Her prize medal confiscated by the state she had served and that had discarded her. Working from London for a democracy she has not stopped believing is possible. Narges Mohammadi, 13 arrests, 5 convictions, 31 years in sentences, 154 lashes and sentences. Nobel Peace Prize accepted by her children while she sat in Evan. Nilufar Hamedi and Ilahe Mohammadi, the journalists who photographed and reported the death that lit the fire, imprisoned for the act of showing the world what had happened. And behind these names, unnamed and uncountable, the women whose resistance did not generate international headlines. The woman who pushed her headscarf back a centimeter and walked to work. The woman who memorized AMER provisions in her marriage contract so she could use them as leverage when the time came. The woman who told her daughter the full history of what Iran had been before 1979 and what it had been made into after, because the telling was itself an act of preservation against the forgetting that the Islamic Republic required. The woman who signed the petition in the park when the 1 million signatures organizer approached her and asked if she believed in equality. The woman who said yes. Every yes was an act of resistance. 45 years of yeses, spoken at personal risk, without guarantee of result, in the face of a system that had the weight of the state and the authority of divine law behind its nose. The women of Iran have been saying yes to freedom since the morning of February 12, 1979, when the revolution's ink was barely dry and the rollbacks had already begun. They have not stopped saying it.
Here is a fact that does not fit the narrative that either the Islamic Republic or its harshest Western critics want to tell. In 1976, 3 years before the revolution, the female adult literacy rate in Iran was 35%. By 2016, it was 81%. In 1978, women made up approximately 3% of Iranian university students. By 2020, they made up 57%. More than half of all university students in Iran, outnumbering men in university enrollment by a ratio that briefly made Iran, by one UNESCO measure, the country with the highest ratio of female to male undergraduates in the world. IranPrimer.USIP. A government that removed women from the judiciary, suspended the family protection law, made the hijab compulsory under penalty of flogging, and assigned women's lives a legal value of half a man's. This same government presided over the most dramatic expansion of female literacy and university education in Iranian history. Both things are true simultaneously. The Islamic Republic is not simply the story of women's oppression, though that story is true and important and must be told.
It is also, in this specific and paradoxical domain, the story of an unintended consequence so large that it has been bending the arc of Iranian politics for 3 decades, creating the educated urban women who have been the backbone of every significant protest movement since the 1990s.
The mechanism of the Islamic Republic's educational expansion was not feminist in its intention. It was Islamic in its logic, and the feminist consequences were entirely accidental. The revolution's commitment to expanding Islamic education across Iran, building schools in rural areas that had previously had none, extending primary and secondary education to communities that the Shah's urban-focused modernization had largely bypassed, was motivated by the desire to create an educated Muslim population, not an educated female one. But girls attended the schools alongside boys, and the literacy campaign that followed the revolution did not distinguish between the genders in its basic educational mission. retrospectjournal.com/2025/06/06/the impact of the 1979 revolution on Iranian women, gains, losses, and contradictions. The expansion of female education into universities followed a similar logic, with a specific added driver: gender segregation. The Islamic Republic's insistence on separating men and women in public life created an enormous institutional demand for female professionals to serve female clients: female doctors for female patients, female teachers for female students, female nurses, female pharmacists, female counselors. The revolution's own ideological requirements for gender separation in service provision generated a powerful institutional pull for women's professional education that the revolution's hostility to women's professional presence in mixed settings could not suppress, without undermining the very segregation it had mandated. retrospectjournal.com/2025/06/06/the impact of the 1979 revolution on Iranian women, gains, losses, and contradictions.
The numbers tell a story of unintended consequence at scale. Before the revolution, the number of female physicians in Iran was 1,988. By 2012, that number had reached 20,177, a tenfold increase in the presence of women in medicine, driven substantially by the demand for female physicians that the revolution's gender segregation policies had created. In 1998, Iran won the United Nations Award for closing the gender gap in education, a prize awarded to the government of the Islamic Republic for achieving something that the Islamic Republic had not intended and that was beginning to frighten it. IranPrimer.USIP. By 2002, 62% of those passing Iran's rigorous national university entrance examination, the concours, the competitive test that determines university admission, were female. Not 62% of those applying, 62% of those passing. Iranian women were outperforming Iranian men on the most significant academic competition in the country by a margin large enough to be alarming to a government that had not planned for this outcome and was not comfortable with its implications. The response was revealing. The Education Ministry proposed a quota system to limit female enrollment in medicine and other fields where women were rapidly outnumbering men. Brookings.au. The quota proposal, announced in 2012, when the government declared that women would be excluded from 77 undergraduate programs at 36 universities in fields including engineering, accounting, chemistry, and computer science, was one of the most precise illustrations of the Islamic Republic's relationship with its own unintended consequences. The official justification given by Isfahan University for excluding women from engineering programs was that 98% of female engineering graduates ended up jobless. The justification was simultaneously true, revealing, and self-incriminating. Women were graduating from engineering programs and not getting engineering jobs, not because they were unqualified, but because a society that had been systematically discouraging women's professional presence was not absorbing them into its workforce at the rate their qualifications deserved. The quota system was the government's solution to a problem it had created: too many educated women, not enough space for them in the professional world the Islamic Republic had built. The solution was not to create more space, The solution was to produce fewer educated women. The logic was circular and self-defeating, but it was consistent with the Islamic Republic's broader approach to the contradiction at the heart of its women's policy. When the unintended consequences of its own ideological commitments conflicted with those commitments, it chose to suppress the consequences rather than examine the commitments.
The workforce participation data reveals the contradiction from a different angle. In 1976, before the revolution, women made up approximately 20% of the Iranian paid labor force. By 1986, 7 years into the Islamic Republic, that figure had dropped to approximately 10%, as women were fired from government positions, discouraged from working through financial incentives offered to husbands whose wives resigned, and pushed out of the mixed-gender professional environments that the new ideology found unacceptable. retrospect.journal.com/2025/04/06/the impact of the 1979 revolution on Iranian women, gains, losses, and contradictions. The recovery was slow and uneven. Women's workforce participation remained suppressed for decades by the combination of legal restrictions on certain professions, the cultural pressure of the Islamic Republic's domestic ideology, and the practical barriers created by the requirement that married women obtain their husband's written permission for many professional and financial activities. By the 2010s, Iran had one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world, around 17%, even as it had one of the highest female university enrollment rates. The gap between the educated women Iran was producing and the workforce that was absorbing them was one of the most destabilizing economic and social facts of the late Islamic Republic period. Brookings.com/article/Are Iranian women overeducated? The political participation of women after the revolution followed the same pattern of constrained advance, real presence within severely limited parameters. Women never lost the right to vote that the White Revolution had given them in 1963, and the Islamic Republic, unlike some of its neighbors in the region, maintained women's suffrage throughout its existence. Women voted in significant numbers in Iranian elections, and they voted strategically. The female vote for Mohammad Khatami in 1997 was widely credited as a decisive factor in his unexpected reformist victory, the first clear demonstration of what mobilized female voters could do to the calculus of Iranian electoral politics. Women also ran for elected office and occasionally won. Female members of parliament were a continuous presence in the Islamic Republic's legislature, though in numbers far below their proportion of the population, and with formal limitations on the positions they could hold. The presidency was for practical purposes closed to women. The Guardian Council, the unelected clerical body that vets candidates for all elections, consistently disqualified female presidential candidates on the grounds that the Constitution's requirement that the president be a rajul, a term that the council interpreted as meaning a man, excluded women from the office. The vote was real. The ceiling above it was lower and more solidly constructed than in almost any comparable country. iranprimer.ussip.us.
The most politically significant consequence of the Islamic Republic's educational expansion was the creation, over 3 decades, of a large urban educated female population that had been given the intellectual tools to analyze the system they were living under, the historical knowledge to understand what had been taken from them, and the professional frustration of qualifications that the system was not absorbing. This population, the women who constituted 60% of Iran's university students by the early 2000s, and who were graduating into a labor market and a legal system that treated them as less than their male peers, was not the population that Khomeini had imagined creating when he expanded Islamic education in the early 1980s. It was, in fact, the opposite of what he had imagined. He had imagined educated Muslim women who understood their faith and their role within it. He had created, instead, educated Iranian women who understood the gap between what their education had prepared them for and what the system was willing to give them, and who had both the intellectual framework
and the organizational capacity to articulate that gap in political terms. The university system that the Islamic Republic built to produce compliant Islamic citizens had produced, consistently and inevitably, the critical citizens who were most effectively challenging the Islamic Republic's authority. digitalcommons.pepperdine.edu/cgi/viewcontent.atl/1217/context/global-tides.
The Islamic feminist tradition that emerged from within this educated population was one of the Islamic Republic's most uncomfortable intellectual challenges. Islamic feminism, the attempt to use the tools of Islamic jurisprudence and Quranic interpretation to argue for women's equality from within the Islamic tradition rather than against it, was not the creation of secular opponents of the regime. It was the creation of women who were deeply committed to their Islamic faith and who refused to accept that their faith required their subordination. Scholars like Ziba Mir Hosseini developed rigorous jurisprudential arguments for the compatibility of Islam and gender equality, using the classical methods of Islamic legal reasoning to challenge the interpretations that the Islamic Republic had claimed were the only valid ones. The Islamic Republic found Islamic feminism more difficult to suppress than secular feminism, because the tools it typically used against secular criticism, dismissing critics as westernized, un-Islamic, agents of foreign influence, were not available against critics who were arguing from within the Islamic tradition itself, in the Islamic tradition's own language. The response was to criminalize the specific arguments rather than the category of argument, to declare particular reinterpretations of Quranic verses incorrect, to use the state's religious authority to close down particular lines of scholarly inquiry, to imprison the scholars rather than refute their arguments. But the arguments, once made, could not be unmade. They were in circulation, read by the same educated women who were passing the concours at 62% and being told they could not study engineering.
The contradiction that the Islamic Republic never resolved, that may in fact be unresolvable within its current structure, is the contradiction between the educated population it has produced and the legal and social framework it has maintained. A government that has raised female literacy from 35 to 81%, that has sent women to university in numbers exceeding men, that has produced female doctors and engineers and lawyers and academics in quantities that the Shah's Iran never approached, this government is simultaneously maintaining a legal system that values those women's testimony at half a man's, that requires their husband's permission to travel, that can remove their children at specified ages, that assigns their lives a blood money value of 50%. The educated women of Iran know this contradiction better than anyone. They have the analytical tools, the historical knowledge, and the professional frustration to understand it precisely and to articulate it clearly. And they have been articulating it in university seminars and legal briefs and underground publications and street protests and social media posts and conversations in Tehran apartments, with an increasing confidence that comes from the knowledge that the Islamic Republic's own education system gave them the capacity to see through the system the education system serves. As the words slow and the breathing settles, hold this paradox gently. A government that oppressed women and educated them simultaneously, that removed them from the judiciary and trained them as lawyers, that mandated their covering and sent them to medical school, that assigned their testimony half the weight of a man's and produced a generation of women who could read every law that encoded that half weight and identify every legal argument for changing it, that built the schools that educated the women who marched under woman life freedom in 2022 and understood exactly what they were demanding. The Islamic Republic's greatest unintended achievement, greater arguably than anything it intended, was the creation of the most politically educated, analytically sophisticated, and organizationally capable generation of Iranian women in history. Women who had the literacy their grandmothers had been denied. Women who had the university education that 3% of their mothers had accessed. Women who had, from the contradiction at the heart of their own lives, educated but undervalued, qualified but restricted, prepared for a world the system refused to build, the specific kind of anger that comes not from ignorance but from knowledge. Not the anger of people who do not know what they are missing, the anger of people who know exactly what they are missing and who have the words for it. That anger is the Islamic Republic's most durable creation, and it is the subject of the chapter ahead.
She was 22 years old and she had come to Tehran to visit her brother. Her name in Persian was Masa. Her name in Kurdish, the name her family called her, the name inscribed on her grave, the name that became a chant heard in every language on every continent, was Gina. It means life. On September 13, 2022, Gina Masa Amini was stopped at the Haqqani metro station in Tehran by the Gashte-Ershad, the guidance patrol, for wearing her hijab improperly. She was put in the green van and taken to the Vozara detention facility for re-education. 26 minutes after her arrival, she collapsed. She was taken by ambulance to Qasra Hospital. She never regained consciousness. On September 16, 2022, she died. The Iranian government said she had a pre-existing heart condition. Her family said she had no such condition. The United Nations fact-finding mission, reporting 18 months later, concluded that she had been subjected to physical violence that caused her death. The government's denial was a formality, a ritual response performed for domestic consumption that no one outside the government believed and that many inside it could not have believed either. What mattered was not the denial. What mattered was what happened next.
The protests began at her funeral. In Saqqez, the Kurdish city in western Iran where she had grown up, where her family buried her, the mourners did not go quietly home after the burial. They stayed in the streets. They chanted. And the chant that rose from her graveside, woman, life, freedom, was not a new slogan. It was a translation into Persian of the founding slogan of the Kurdish women's liberation movement, Jin, Jiyan, Azadi. 3 words that carried in that moment not just the grief for one woman, but the accumulated political weight of everything that had preceded her death. Every dismissed female judge, every suspended family protection law, every woman beaten in a green van, every daughter whose marriage age had been set at 9, every mother whose children had been taken at age 2. The chant spread from Saqqez to Tehran in hours. Within days, it had spread to every province of Iran. Within weeks, it had been heard in cities on every continent: Paris, London, New York, Toronto, Berlin, Seoul, Melbourne. Iranian women in the diaspora and non-Iranian women who recognized something in those 3 words cutting across language and geography. The specificity of the Iranian grievance becoming, in the translation, a universal statement about what freedom means and who it belongs to.
What the uprising looked like in its first weeks was unlike anything Iran had seen since the revolution itself. Women led it, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a physical fact, their bodies at the front of the confrontations, their hair cut and held up as flags of defiance, their headscarves removed and waved in the air or burned in the street, in scenes that transmitted across social media at a speed the Islamic Republic had no mechanism to fully suppress. Schoolgirls, teenagers, children, confronted Islamic Republic officials in their own schools, shouting them out of auditoriums, tearing down photographs of Khamenei, doing at 14 and 15 what their mothers and grandmothers had been punished for doing at twice their age. The men came out too. This was one of the uprising's most politically significant features, the degree to which the woman life freedom movement crossed the gender line that the Islamic Republic had for 43 years drawn so carefully. Young Iranian men, who might in earlier generations have stood aside from women's rights activism as not their issue, stood in the streets alongside the women, chanted the same chant, took the same tear gas and the same bullets, and in doing so affirmed what the women's movement had been arguing since the first International Women's Day protest of 1979, that this was not a women's problem, it was a freedom problem, and freedom, when denied, is everyone's problem.
The Islamic Republic's response followed the pattern of every previous crackdown, but at a scale and a ferocity calibrated to the scale of the threat. Internet blackouts were imposed to prevent the spread of images and the coordination of protests. Security forces used tear gas, metal pellets, and live ammunition against crowds that included teenagers and children. At least 552 protesters were killed in the initial months of the uprising, including at least 47 minors, children shot for being in the streets of their own cities. Hundreds of others were blinded by metal pellets fired by security forces. Tens of thousands were arrested. The UN fact-finding mission documented what the Islamic Republic's weapons did to the bodies of the people they were used against. Shotguns, assault rifles, and submachine guns fired into crowds in situations where there was no imminent threat to the security forces. The documentation was clinical in its language and devastating in its implications. A government using military weapons against civilians whose crime was protest, whose offense was presence in public space with the wrong words on their lips, and in many cases, the wrong amount of hair showing above their collars.
The executions began within months. The Islamic Republic used the charge of moharebe, enmity against God, and efsad fil ars, corruption on earth, to prosecute protesters on capital charges. These were not charges that described acts of violence. They were charges that described political opposition, the existence of a person in active resistance to the divine authority that the Islamic Republic claimed to represent. To be the enemy of God in this jurisprudential framework was to be the enemy of the state. And the state's response to its enemies, when it chose to demonstrate that response fully, was death. At least 8 men were executed in connection with the 2022 uprising. The executions were conducted without the procedural protections that even Iran's own courts nominally required: sham trials, coerced confessions, rushed processes that moved from arrest to execution in weeks. The Islamic Republic was not attempting justice, it was attempting deterrence. The use of visible, publicized death as a message to everyone who had been in the streets that the cost of opposition, if the state chose to enforce it fully, was life itself.
The surveillance technology that the Islamic Republic deployed in the aftermath of the uprising was new in its sophistication, but continuous with the enforcement logic that had governed the morality police's operations since the 1980s. Facial recognition cameras were installed at metro stations and major intersections, their footage used to identify women who appeared in public without hijab and issue summonses to their registered addresses. The digital surveillance infrastructure that the Islamic Republic had been building for years was now directed specifically at hijab enforcement, the political project of controlling women's appearance in public space, augmented by the technological tools of the 21st century surveillance state. Restaurants, shops, and pharmacies that served uncovered women were closed. Business owners whose premises appeared in videos circulating on social media with uncovered female customers were prosecuted. The enforcement was moving from the individual body to the entire physical infrastructure of public life. If the morality police could not be on every street simultaneously, the cameras could be everywhere, and the businesses that might provide shelter for non-compliance could be threatened with closure. The apparatus of control was adapting, becoming more distributed, harder to evade, more embedded in the physical landscape of daily life. The chastity and hijab law passed by the Iranian parliament in October 2023, in direct response to the uprising that Amini's death had triggered, was the Islamic Republic's legislative answer to the most serious challenge it had faced in decades. The law dramatically increased the penalties for hijab violations. Women could now face prison sentences of up to 10 years, fines equivalent to thousands of dollars, and bans from social media, from employment, from education, from travel. It was a law written in the specific language of a government that understood it was losing the street battle, that the combination of formal enforcement and informal pressure was not producing the compliance it had maintained for 4 decades, and that was responding to the loss of compliance by escalating the consequences of non-compliance to levels designed to make the calculation of resistance impossible. Iran's own president, Masoud Pezeshkian, elected in 2024 on a relatively reformist platform, acknowledged publicly by early 2026 that the new hijab law simply could not be enforced. Not that it should not be enforced, that it could not be. That the gap between what the law required and what the population was doing had grown too large for any enforcement apparatus to close. That the Islamic Republic had produced through its own educational expansion and its own 45 years of accumulated resentment, a population of women who were no longer willing to comply, regardless of the consequences the law threatened. The law was still on the books, the enforcement was still ongoing, the compliance was not returning.
The global resonance of woman life freedom was one of the 2022 uprising's most distinctive features. The degree to which 3 words from a Kurdish women's liberation tradition, spoken first over a grave in western Iran, became something that people on every continent recognized as speaking to their own situation. The movement was awarded the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament in 2023, the award accepted on behalf of the imprisoned, the exiled, and the dead who had made the movement. Athletes at the 2022 World Cup removed their hijabs or refused to wear them in acts of solidarity that were seen by hundreds of millions of viewers. The international resonance was not simply solidarity tourism, the observation of someone else's struggle from a comfortable distance. It was the recognition, expressed through the specific translation of those 3 words into every language that carried them, that the question the Iranian women's movement had been asking since International Women's Day 1979 was a universal question. Does the state own the female body? Does the government get to decide what women wear, how they appear, what their presence in public space is permitted to look like? Iran had given the sharpest and most painful possible answer to that question over 45 years. The question itself belonged to everyone.
3 years after Mahsa Amini's death, the uprising's legacy was unfinished yet irreversible. The Islamic Republic had survived. Its coercive apparatus remained operational, the executions continued, the arrests continued, the surveillance infrastructure was more sophisticated than it had ever been. The women who had cut their hair and burned their headscarves in September 2022 were still in Iran, still watched, still subject to a legal system that had not changed its foundational inequalities and had added new enforcement tools to the old ones. And yet something had changed that could not be unchanged. The fiction of public compliance, the carefully constructed image of a veiled population that accepted or at least did not openly resist the Islamic Republic's authority over their bodies, had been destroyed by the 2022 uprising and could not be fully reconstructed. The cameras and the new laws and the facial recognition surveillance were evidence not of control, but of its absence, of a government that needed an escalating enforcement apparatus precisely because the voluntary compliance it had once relied on had collapsed. The Islamic Republic's greatest weapon had always been the performance of social consensus. The women who removed their headscarves in September 2022 had taken that weapon away. As the words slow and the breathing settles, hold Gina. 22 years old and visiting her brother in Tehran. Stopped at a metro station for the way she wore a piece of cloth. Dead 3 days later in a hospital she arrived at in a coma. Her Kurdish name meaning life. Her gravestone in Sakez reading, Gina, dear, you will not die. Your name will turn into a symbol. Her name did turn into a symbol, but the symbol was not an abstraction. It was the compression into one specific young woman's specific death of everything that the preceding chapters of this series have documented. The dismissed female judges of 1979, the suspended family protection laws, the mothers who lost their children at age 2, the daughters whose inheritance was half their brother's, the women who signed petitions and went to prison for signing them, the lawyers who defended political prisoners and had their Nobel medals confiscated, the girls who outperformed every expectation in university and were told the engineering programs were closing to them, the 45 years of accumulated inequality,
encoded in law, enforced in green vans, maintained by a state that had built its legitimacy on the proposition that divine authority required the subordination of women. All of it was in that name. All of it is in that chant. Woman, life, freedom. 3 words that contain 45 years of history, spoken first over a grave in Kurdistan, still being spoken in Tehran apartments and diaspora demonstrations and prison cells in Evin, every day that the Islamic Republic has not yet answered the question they pose. Still, today, now.
We have now traveled the full length of this story, from the world that existed before 1979, through the revolution that women helped make and that turned against them, through the specific laws that dismantled their rights and the specific institution that enforced those laws and killed Mahsa Amini, through the resistance that never stopped and the contradictions that the Islamic Republic could never resolve, to the uprising that shook the regime more seriously than anything since the revolution itself. The story is not finished. It is still unfolding, today, in Tehran apartments and Evin prison cells, and diaspora demonstrations, and the ongoing contest between the Islamic Republic's surveillance apparatus and the women who refuse to comply with it. But before we close, we owe the story a question that we have been approaching throughout, and that now demands a direct answer. Why? Not why in the sense of Khomeini's theology or the specific provisions of the Islamic Penal Code. Those whys have been answered in the preceding chapters. But why in the deeper structural sense? What are the conditions that allowed decades of accumulated rights to collapse in months? What does Iran's experience reveal about how rights work, how they are built, how they are lost, and what makes the difference between rights that survive political upheaval and rights that do not? And what does any of this have to do with the world beyond Iran, with the lives of people who have never been to Tehran and may never go? The first structural explanation for why women's rights collapsed so fast in 1979 is the one that Chapter 1 identified, and that has threaded through every subsequent chapter. The rights were real, but their foundations were shallow. They rested on the will of one man, the Shah, rather than on a broad social consensus, a democratic mandate, an independent judiciary, or an institutional framework with enough independent legitimacy to survive the removal of its creator. When the Shah fell, the rights he had created fell with him, not because the rights themselves were wrong or unjust, but because they had been built on a foundation that was a single person rather than a principle. This is the lesson about rights that authoritarian modernizers consistently fail to learn, or that they learn and choose to ignore because the lesson is inconvenient for their style of governance. Rights granted by a strong leader are only as durable as that leader's rule. Rights that exist because one person decided they should exist can be ended by the next person who decides differently. The Shah's feminism was real in its effects and hollow in its foundations. It produced female judges and female members of parliament, but it produced them within a system that had no mechanism for defending those women's positions once the Shah's personal commitment to defending them was gone. The second structural explanation is the one that Chapter 2 examined with the most discomfort: the political framework within which the Iranian left, including its substantial female membership, evaluated the question of women's rights in 1979. The hierarchy of oppressions that placed national liberation and anti-imperialism above what it dismissed as bourgeois feminism had as its practical consequence the deferral of women's specific concerns to a later moment that never arrived. The lesson from 1979 that analysts have drawn most consistently is the danger of a hierarchical version of anti-imperialism that placed national sovereignty above issues of equal rights or democracy. The women who subordinated their feminist demands to the revolutionary coalition did not do so because they were naive or foolish. They did it within a coherent ideological framework that many intelligent people shared. But the framework was wrong in its assumption that the liberation of women would automatically follow from national liberation, an assumption that the Islamic Republic refuted within weeks of its establishment. The lesson is not that women should have stayed home from the revolution. The lesson is that any revolution that does not explicitly include women's rights in its foundational commitments has not actually included women, whatever it may say. The third structural explanation is the one most directly relevant to the contemporary world, the role of institutions. The family protection laws created rights, but rights without institutional defenders are permanently vulnerable to the next political change. An independent judiciary, genuinely independent, not appointed by and accountable to the political leadership, can protect rights after the political leadership changes. A free press can document violations and create political costs for the government that commits them. A functioning civil society with protected space to organize, advocate, and resist can maintain pressure for rights even when the government is hostile to them. Iran in 1979 had none of these. The Shah's courts were not independent. His press was not free. His civil society organizations operated at his sufferance and were associated with his regime. When the regime changed, there were no independent institutions standing between the new government's ideology and its practical implementation. The laws changed in months because there was nothing institutional to slow the change, no check on the new government's power to rewrite the legal framework as quickly as it chose. What the women of Iran needed in 1979 was not just better laws, it was the institutional infrastructure that makes good laws durable. Independent courts, a free press, genuine civil society. The Shah had not built any of that. Neither in 45 years has the Islamic Republic.
The fourth structural explanation is perhaps the most uncomfortable because it applies not just to Iran, but to the global pattern of women's rights and their vulnerability. Rights for women have historically been among the first concessions made in political settlements between secular and religious or traditional forces, and among the last rights restored when those settlements collapse. When revolutionary coalitions fracture, when democratic transitions are negotiated, when peace settlements are reached, the rights of women are often traded away in the process of building consensus among men who have other priorities. The Iranian left's deferral of feminist demands to the larger revolution, the Arab Spring's failure to produce durable gains for women in most of the countries where it erupted, the Taliban's immediate reversal of women's educational rights in Afghanistan on return to power in 2021. The pattern is too consistent across too many contexts to be coincidental. Women's rights are bargaining chips in political negotiations among men, not universally, not inevitably, but with a frequency that requires explanation. The explanation is structural. In most political systems, women remain underrepresented in the decision-making processes where these bargains are struck. The people trading away women's rights are rarely the people who hold them. The people who hold them are rarely in the room. The lesson is not that women should not participate in broader political struggles. The women of Iran were right to oppose the Shah. The lesson is that participation must be conditional. The freedom we fight for must be freedom for us, not freedom for men who will then decide what women deserve.
The fifth structural explanation is the one that Iran's own history most powerfully illustrates, because it is visible running through a century of Iranian women's activism, from the constitutional revolution of 1905-1911 to the woman life freedom uprising of 2022. The relationship between rights and the people who hold them. Rights that exist only on paper, that are granted by governments rather than claimed by organized populations, can be taken back by the same mechanism that created them, a government decision. Rights that exist because a population has organized to claim them, built institutions to defend them, developed the consciousness to understand them as rights rather than privileges, and demonstrated the willingness to resist their removal. These rights are harder to take, because taking them requires confronting not just a legal text, but a living population that knows what it has and will not accept losing it.
The tragedy of 1979 was not simply that Khomeini had the power to remove women's rights. It was that the specific rights he removed had not yet been claimed deeply enough by enough of Iranian society to make their removal prohibitively costly. The women who marched on International Women's Day 1979 understood this. The women who organized the 1 million signatures campaign understood it, which is why they built their campaign around face-to-face conversations rather than institutional lobbying, around consciousness raising rather than legal advocacy alone. You cannot defend rights that the people who hold them do not fully know they hold. The Iranian women's movement has been, in part, a 45-year project of making Iranian women know what they hold and what it would mean to lose it.
The sixth structural explanation is the one that human rights organizations have been naming with increasing directness in recent years. What the Islamic Republic has built is not discrimination against women. It is a system, a deliberately designed, institutionalized system of domination intended to entrench the power of the government. UN experts have concluded that the Islamic Republic's new hijab law, combined with the full apparatus of discriminatory legislation in place since 1979, constitutes a form of gender apartheid, a systematic, institutionalized, state-enforced regime of discrimination whose purpose is the maintenance of the dominant group's power through the permanent subordination of another group. Gender apartheid. The term is precise and deliberately chosen. It places Iran in the same analytical category as racial apartheid in South Africa, not a collection of individual discriminatory acts, but a designed system. The comparison carries implications. If racial apartheid in South Africa required and ultimately responded to multilateral pressure, boycotts, and divestments, then the international community's response to gender apartheid in Iran has been, by the same standard, inadequate. The naming matters. The category matters. What you call a thing determines what you think should be done about it.
The reason this still matters, beyond the borders of Iran, beyond the specific provisions of the Islamic Penal Code, beyond the green van and the gasht-e-irshad and the blood money at 50%, is the lesson that Iran encodes about the relationship between freedom and the bodies that hold it. The Islamic Republic has for 45 years made the female body the primary site of its political authority. The hijab is not incidental to the Islamic Republic's power, it is central to it. A government that can decide what a woman wears in public is a government that has asserted authority over the most intimate domain of personal life. A government that has established that authority over women's bodies has demonstrated its capacity for that category of control over everyone. The women of Iran understood this before almost anyone else did, because they were the first and most direct targets of it. They understood, and they said clearly from the first International Women's Day March of 1979, that the question of who controls women's bodies is a freedom question, not a women's question. That a government willing to administer 74 lashes to enforce a dress code is a government willing to do much else with the authority that enforcement establishes. That the freedom of a society can be accurately measured by the freedom of its women, not as a metaphor, but as a direct empirical claim. The states that restrict women's bodies most severely are without exception the states that restrict everyone's freedom most severely. The female body is the canary. Its condition tells you everything about the mine.
What comes next in Iran is not knowable from here. The Islamic Republic has survived everything: the 8-year war with Iraq, the 2009 Green Movement, the 2019 economic protests, the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising. It has survived by killing enough people to demonstrate that survival is the price of active resistance, and by adapting its control apparatus with enough sophistication to stay ahead of each new form that resistance has taken. It is a durable authoritarian system with deep institutional roots, a large security apparatus, significant oil revenues, and the willingness to use violence at whatever scale the threat requires. And yet the Iran of 2026 is not the Iran of 1980 or 1990 or even 2010.
The educated population that the Islamic Republic's own schools produced has not become more compliant as it has become more educated. It has become less so. The women who constitute 60% of Iran's university graduates are not accepting the legal status of half-persons with the resignation of women who do not understand their situation. They understand it precisely, name it accurately, and resist it continuously. The Islamic Republic's own president has acknowledged that the hijab law cannot be enforced. The compliance that the regime requires is not there. The surveillance apparatus is evidence of its absence. As the words slow for the last time, as the breathing settles into the stillness that ends a long journey, let the full arc of this story rest together. A girl in Tehran in 1975, wearing whatever she chose to work. A woman in Tehran in 1979, marching against the government she had helped bring to power, chanting in the dawn of freedom, there is an absence of freedom. A judge dismissed from the bench in 1979 and refused the clerkship offered in its place, who became instead the world's most recognized human rights lawyer. A young woman in Saqqez named Gina, meaning life, stopped at a metro station in 2022 for the way she wore a piece of cloth, dead 3 days later. Her gravestone reading, "Your name will turn into a symbol." The women of Iran have been telling the same story since 1979. The story of what it costs to make a revolution and find yourself on the wrong side of its mourning. The story of what it takes to resist a state that has the weight of divine authority behind its claim to control your body. The story of what it means to be educated by the very system that is oppressing you, to have its own tools in your hands, to use those tools against the system that gave them to you. The story of how rights are lost, fast, in the aftermath of political upheaval, when the institutional foundations are shallow and the warning voices are dismissed, and how they are fought for again, slowly, at personal cost, without guarantee of result, by people who have decided that the cost of not fighting is higher than the cost of fighting. That is the story of Iranian women since 1979. It is also the story of what freedom requires from everyone who holds it. The vigilance, the institutional investment, the refusal to defer what matters to a later moment that may not come, the insistence that no coalition, no revolution, no political settlement is legitimate if it trades the freedom of half its population for the convenience of the other half. Woman, life, freedom. 3 words, 45 years of history behind them. The argument they make is not finished. It never is, anywhere, until it is won.